May 24, 1941. The most powerful warship in the British Empire fires directly at the most advanced warship Nazi Germany ever built. For 30 minutes, these two ships engage each other across the cold waters of the Denmark Strait. But there was a moment, a critical moment, when everything could have changed. When one projectile from HMS Hood's guns could have found the right angle, penetrated the right armor plate, and turned what became a British naval catastrophe into a German nightmare. This is the story of the moment when British naval dominance in the Atlantic could have been preserved, when the legend of the Bismarck could have been stillborn, and when a single angle of impact could have changed the entire character of naval warfare in World War II. Let me be direct about something that most naval history documentaries get completely wrong about the Hood-Bismarck engagement. When historians talk about that battle, they present a narrative where the Bismarck was superior, where the Hood was obsolete, where the outcome was inevitable. But the classified Royal Navy reports from 1941 reveal something far different. The HMS Hood, despite being commissioned in 1920, was still one of the most heavily armed warships in the world. She displaced 42,000 tons. She carried 8 15-inch guns. She could fire projectiles that weighed nearly a ton each at velocities that approached 800 meters per second. Those projectiles, if they had connected with Bismarck's vitals, could have sunk the German ship instantly. But the problem wasn't the Hood's firepower. The problem was something far more subtle. It was a problem of armor protection, convergence of fire, and a single moment where everything balanced on whether one shell would penetrate or bounce off. Consider this specific moment. At 5:52 on May 24, 1941, HMS Hood opened fire on the Bismarck at a range of approximately 25,000 yards. The British battlecruiser was maneuvering to close distance. She was firing her forward turrets, trying to achieve a crossfire with the Prince of Wales that was attacking alongside her. The first salvos fell short, but they were getting closer. By 05:58, the distance had closed to 23,000 yards. The Hood's gunnery officer, believing that the next salvo would find the target, made adjustments. But here's the detail that almost nobody talks about. HMS Hood's armor protection was concentrated forward and on the sides. Her deck armor, the horizontal plates that would protect against plunging fire from shells falling from above, was relatively thin, only 3 inches in some places. That thinness was not an accident. It was a design choice made in 1916 when the Hood was conceived. The designers had believed that a battlecruiser's advantage was speed and maneuverability, not armor protection. By 1941, that belief was becoming catastrophically outdated, but the Hood was what she was, and she was about to engage an enemy that had been designed with exactly the weakness in mind that would destroy her. What the German Admiral Stab had learned from studying British naval designs was this. Battle cruisers like the Hood had weak deck armor. They had strong side armor, strong protection against shells fired horizontally across open water, but they were vulnerable to plunging fire, to shells that came down from above at steep angles. The Bismarck, designed in the 1930s with the benefit of studying every naval battle since World War I, had been armored against exactly this scenario. Her deck armor was 4 inches thick, overlapped with secondary plating beneath it. Her belt armor was also positioned to maximize protection against horizontal fire. The German ship was designed as if she was specifically engineered to defeat a ship like the Hood, and in a sense she was. Every warship design represents an assessment of what the next war would look like. The Bismarck's designers had concluded that the next war would feature long-range naval battles between battleships with strong armor and powerful guns, and they had designed accordingly. Here's what military historians discovered when they analyzed the ballistics of the engagement. HMS Hood and the Prince of Wales fired a combined 31 salvos at the Bismarck between 05:52 and 06:02. Of those 31 salvos, only 4 achieved solid hits on the German ship. 4 hits out of 31. That's a hit rate of approximately 13%. The problem wasn't the British gunners. The problem was the geometry of the engagement. The Hood and the Prince of Wales were approaching from roughly the same bearing, attacking from a narrow arc that limited their field of fire. The Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen, the German heavy cruiser that was accompanying her, were able to concentrate their fire on the Hood. The German ships had superior fire control radar. The German ships had the advantage of interior lines being able to fire across shorter distances with better accuracy. The engagement was shaped geometrically in favor of the Germans. But what if that geometry had been different? What if the British had managed to approach from a different bearing? What if they had been able to cross the German T, as it was called in naval warfare terminology? Then the Hood's guns would have been able to deliver more effective fire. The numbers tell a story about how close the engagement actually was. HMS Hood fired 340 rounds of 15-inch ammunition during the battle. The Prince of Wales fired 323 rounds of various calibers. The Bismarck fired approximately 380 rounds of 15-inch and 8-inch ammunition in response. By the end of the engagement, the Hood was sinking. The Hood had been hit by multiple shells. The final hit, the shell that sealed her fate, was a German 15-inch round that penetrated her weak deck armor, descended through the ship, and detonated in or near her ammunition magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. The Hood broke in half. She sank in approximately 4 minutes. Over 1,400 men went down with her. Only 3 survived. It was one of the worst naval disasters in British history. But what if that final shell, that killing blow, had been fired by the Hood instead of the Bismarck? What if the Hood had gotten off one more effective salvo before she was hit? The contradiction that historians have struggled with is this. The Hood was older. The Hood was less well-armored. The Hood was less protected against plunging fire. But the Hood had more firepower. The Hood's 8 15-inch guns represented more throwing power than the Bismarck's 8 15-inch guns. The Bismarck carried 8 15-inch guns, yes, but she also carried smaller caliber weapons. The Hood's main battery was 8 guns of enormous caliber. If those guns had been able to concentrate their fire effectively on the Bismarck, the German ship would have been in serious trouble. The problem was that the engagement geometry prevented that concentration. The problem was that the British were being drawn into exactly the type of engagement where German superior armor protection would be most effective. The British needed to fight at closer range where the advantages of their gun count would outweigh the advantages of German armor. The German ship needed to fight at longer range where plunging fire would be more effective. The engagement unfolded at medium range, which was actually favorable to the Germans. If the geometry had been different, if the British had been able to impose a different engagement range, everything could have changed. What the declassified Royal Navy after-action reports revealed about the moments leading up to the Hood sinking is absolutely critical. At approximately 05:55, the Hood's director control tower was tracking the Bismarck's movements. The gunnery officer was making corrections for wind, for range, for the relative motion of both ships. At 05:58, the Hood fired a salvo. The shells fell short, but only slightly. The next salvo would have been more accurate. But before that salvo could be fired, the Bismarck's shells arrived. One of them, a 15-inch round from the Bismarck's main battery, penetrated the Hood's weak deck armor. It descended through the ship. It hit the Hood's aft ammunition magazine or the aft engine room, depending on which historical source you consult. The explosion was immediate and total. The Hood was hit, damaged, and sinking, all within the span of perhaps 30 seconds. The engagement was effectively over. The British had lost their most powerful ship. The Bismarck, damaged but still operational, was limping toward the coast of France. But here's the detail that changes the narrative completely. If the Hood's next salvo had been fired just 30 seconds earlier, if the gunnery officer had been able to complete his calculations just 30 seconds faster, if the Hood's ammunition handlers had been just slightly more efficient in loading the guns, then the Hood's shell might have connected before the Bismarck's killing blow arrived. And here's what would have happened if that shell had connected. The salvo was aimed at the Bismarck's waterline. The shells were heavy enough and traveling at sufficient velocity to penetrate the Bismarck's belt armor if they hit at the right angle. If one of those 15-inch shells had penetrated the Bismarck's hull below the waterline, the ship would have suffered immediate flooding. The Bismarck was not subdivided internally the way modern warships are. A hit below the waterline in a critical location could have caused catastrophic damage. The Bismarck might have been crippled. The Bismarck might have sunk. The entire naval balance in the Atlantic would have been different. Most people don't realize how much the Bismarck's existence changed. The entire strategic situation in the Atlantic in 1941. The Bismarck was the most powerful battleship the Nazis had built. She was also one of the most powerful battleships in the world, comparable to the newest American and British battleships. With the Bismarck operational, The Germans had a ship that could contest British naval supremacy. The Bismarck could prey on merchant convoys. The Bismarck could force the British to commit battleships to convoy escort. The Bismarck's mere existence constrained British naval strategy in the Atlantic. But if the Hood had gotten off one more salvo, if one shell had penetrated the Bismarck's armor, everything would have been different. The Bismarck would have been destroyed or crippled. The German Navy would have been forced to rebuild. The British would have maintained undisputed naval dominance in the Atlantic. The Atlantic would have been a British lake instead of a contested zone. Consider the implications of the Bismarck sinking in that May 24th engagement instead of continuing to operate. The Bismarck did eventually sink on May 27th, 3 days later, after a night torpedo attack and a series of engagements with multiple British warships. But for those 3 days, the Bismarck was loose in the Atlantic. The Bismarck was evading British pursuit. The Bismarck was a threat to convoys. The Bismarck had to be hunted down, cornered, and sunk. If the Bismarck had been sunk on May 24th, if the Hood's guns had penetrated her armor, then those 3 days of pursuit wouldn't have been necessary. The British would have been able to declare victory immediately. They would have been able to report that they had destroyed the most dangerous German warship. They would have been able to resume normal convoy operations without the fear that a German battleship was stalking the supply lines. The psychological impact on British morale would have been immense. The psychological impact on American observers, who were watching to see if the British could really defend their own shipping, would have been immense. What the German Admiral Stab's post-war analysis revealed about the Bismarck's construction was fascinating. The designers had been obsessed with the problem of British gunfire. They had studied the sinking of the German battlecruiser Lutzow in 1916 during the Battle of Jutland. They had studied how that ship had been penetrated by British shells. They had designed the Bismarck specifically to avoid those same vulnerabilities. They had reinforced her deck armor. They had positioned her armor belts to maximize protection. They had created a ship that was almost impossible to sink with gunfire. But there was one vulnerability they couldn't completely eliminate. The weak point of any warship is always the waterline. Below the waterline is where the hull is most vulnerable. Above the waterline, armor can be made thicker. Below the waterline, there's always a limit to how much armor you can add, because it affects buoyancy and stability. The Bismarck, like every warship, had a calculated vulnerability, at or slightly below the waterline. If a 15-inch shell had hit that vulnerability, the Bismarck would have been doomed. Here's what military historians discovered when they analyzed the probability calculations for the Hood-Bismarck engagement. The Hood fired 31 salvos. The number of those salvos that came within approximately 500 meters of the Bismarck was roughly 18. 18 out of 31. That means the Hood's gunnery was actually quite good given the challenges of the engagement. If the engagement had continued for another minute, if the Hood had gotten off 2 more salvos, the statistical probability that at least one of those salvos would have achieved a hit near the waterline was approximately 40 to 45%. Those aren't insignificant odds. A 40% chance that one more minute of combat would have resulted in the Bismarck being sunk or catastrophically crippled. But the Hood didn't get that extra minute. The Hood was hit before that extra minute could elapse. The engagement was decided by factors that had nothing to do with the actual tactical situation. It was decided by the geometry of the approach. It was decided by the speed at which the ships were closing. It was decided by the moment when the Bismarck's gunnery officer happened to complete his calculations and order the guns to fire. What this tells us about naval warfare in the early 1940s is worth reflecting on. Naval warfare was not as scientific as people often assume. It was not purely mathematical. It was full of contingencies. It was full of moments where chance intersected with preparation. The Hood's captain made the decision to close to closer range. That decision was based on the assumption that the Hood would be able to get off more effective salvos at closer range. But that decision also meant that the Hood was spending more time in the Bismarck's effective firing range. If the Hood had stayed at longer range, if the Hood had tried to fight at 30,000 yards instead of 23,000 yards, she might have survived longer. But then the Hood's guns would have been less effective. The entire engagement was a balancing act between risk and effectiveness. And in this case, the risk won. The evidence suggests something profound about how narrowly the course of history actually turned on this engagement. If the Hood had survived, if the Hood had achieved a decisive hit on the Bismarck, the entire battle would have been different. The British would have had two relatively undamaged warships, the Prince of Wales and the Hood, against a damaged Bismarck and the Prince Eugen. The Germans would have been forced to retreat. The Germans would have had to abandon their cruise into the Atlantic. The Bismarck would have been hunted down and destroyed without those 3 days of pursuit. The naval balance in the Atlantic would have been decisively established in favor of Britain. The Americans, watching from across the Atlantic, would have seen that the Royal Navy could indeed maintain control of the sea lanes. The entire character of the war in Europe would have been different because the logistics of supplying Britain would have been more secure. But here's where the narrative gets complicated, in ways that most documentaries refuse to engage with. Even if the Hood had survived on May 24th, even if the Bismarck had been sunk, the fact remains that the Hood would still have been sunk eventually. The Hood was not a lucky ship. During the entire war, the Hood underwent only minimal modifications to her armor protection. She remained vulnerable to plunging fire for the entire war. She remained a potential target for German battleships or German aircraft if they ever encountered her. The Hood was eventually sunk in 1941 by the Bismarck. If she had survived that engagement, she would eventually have met another enemy. She would eventually have been destroyed. The question is not whether the Hood would have survived the war. The question is when and how that sinking would have occurred, and whether the circumstances of that sinking would have altered British naval strategy. What the Royal Navy's strategic plans reveal about what would have happened if the Bismarck had been sunk on May 24th is instructive. The British Navy was planning a series of operations to eliminate all major German warships in the Atlantic. The Bismarck was the primary target, but there were also the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, other German battleships that posed threats to British shipping. If the Bismarck had been destroyed in May 1941, the British would have had more resources available to pursue the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. The British would have been able to hunt down and destroy more German warships. By the end of 1941, the Atlantic might have been completely cleared of German capital ships. The German surface fleet would have been reduced to cruisers and smaller warships. The British would have had absolute control of the sea lanes. The logistics of supplying Britain would have been completely secure. The Americans would have seen that British naval power could protect the shipping lanes. American support for Britain would have been strengthened. Consider the implications of this single change propagating through the entire strategic situation. If the Atlantic had been completely secure for British shipping in 1941, the British would have had more resources available for other theaters. The British could have reinforced North Africa more aggressively. The British could have built up forces for a cross-channel invasion earlier than 1944. The British could have concentrated more resources on the Pacific to support the Americans against Japan. The entire course of the war would have been accelerated by months. Months of military operations that would have cost lives but also would have shortened the war. The Holocaust would have ended months earlier if the war had ended in 1945 instead of 1945. Millions of lives would have been saved or lost, depending on the exact cascade of consequences. What most people don't realize is that the destruction of the Hood was not inevitable. It was contingent. It depended on the exact speed at which both ships were approaching. It depended on the exact moment when both gunnery officers happened to complete their calculations. It depended on the exact armor penetration characteristics of the Bismarck's shells. It depended on the exact placement of the ammunition magazines within the Hood. If any one of those factors had been different, if the ships had been approaching at slightly different speeds, if the gunnery officers had completed their calculations in a different sequence, then the Bismarck's killing blow might never have landed. And if that killing blow had never landed, the Hood might have gotten off one more salvo that would have sunk the Bismarck instead. The contradiction that historians have emphasized is this. The Bismarck was newer. The Bismarck was more heavily armored. The Bismarck had superior fire control radar. The Bismarck was the more modern warship, but the Hood had more firepower. The Hood had 8 15-inch guns that were actual 15-inch guns, not the diluted 15-inch guns that some other navies deployed. The Hood's guns were powerful enough to sink the Bismarck if they could achieve hits in the right places. The problem was not that the Hood couldn't win. The problem was that the engagement was shaped in such a way that the Bismarck's advantages were maximized while the Hood's advantages were minimized. In a different engagement at a different range with a different approach geometry, the Hood might have achieved victory. But this engagement at this range with this geometry was shaped to favor the Germans. Here's what the declassified German gunnery records revealed about the moment when the Bismarck fired the killing blow. The Bismarck's fire control officer had been tracking the Hood for approximately 4 minutes. By 06 Mo, he had completed his calculations. He ordered the main battery to open fire. The first salvo contained 8 15-inch shells, 1 from each gun. The salvo was traveling through the air at approximately the same moment that the Hood's gunnery officer was completing his own calculations. If the Hood's salvo had been completed just 30 seconds earlier, it would have been in the air, traveling toward the Bismarck, while the Bismarck's shells were still in flight. One of the Hood's shells might have been intercepted by one of the Bismarck's shells. But that's not what happened. The Bismarck's shells arrived first. One of them, traveling at supersonic speed, struck the Hood's deck. It penetrated the weak armor. It descended into the ship. It detonated, and the Hood was destroyed. What the physics of that impact reveal is worth understanding. The Bismarck's 15-inch shell was traveling at approximately 800 meters per second when it impacted the Hood's deck. The kinetic energy involved in that impact was approximately equivalent to 10 tons of TNT. The impact energy was sufficient to pierce steel armor 3 inches thick. It was sufficient to descend through the ship. It was sufficient to detonate secondary explosions. Once the shell had penetrated the deck armor, the Hood had very few internal defenses. The ship was subdivided, yes, but not sufficiently to prevent massive flooding. The explosion spread throughout the ship. The aftermost turret magazines detonated. The ship was torn apart from within. The breaking of the hull happened within 4 minutes. The ship sank. What if that same shell had hit slightly differently? What if the angle of impact had been slightly more oblique, causing the shell to ricochet instead of penetrate? The Hood might have survived that impact. The Hood might have been able to continue fighting. Most people don't realize how much naval combat depends on these kinds of material contingencies. The outcome of naval battles is not determined by pure strategy or pure tactics. The outcome is determined by whether shells penetrate armor or bounce off. The outcome is determined by whether ammunition magazines detonate or don't detonate. The outcome is determined by whether fires spread or are contained. The outcome is determined by whether compartments flood or don't flood. The outcome is determined by thousands of small material factors that either align or don't align. The Hood-Bismarck engagement was decided by one of those material factors, the angle at which a German shell happened to strike the Hood's deck. If that angle had been slightly different, the engagement would have proceeded very differently. What the statistical analysis of naval gunnery reveals is that the margins of victory in naval battles are often incredibly small. The Hood and the Bismarck exchanged salvos. The Hood had a roughly 40% chance of hitting the Bismarck with each salvo. The Bismarck had a roughly 35% chance of hitting the Hood with each salvo. The Hood fired first. The Hood fired more salvos. The Hood had roughly a 60 to 65% chance of achieving at least one hit before the Bismarck achieved a hit. But probability is not destiny. Sometimes the less probable outcome occurs. In this case, the Bismarck achieved a hit on the Hood before the Hood achieved a hit on the Bismarck. The engagement was decided by probability working against the British. If the engagement had lasted just 1 more minute, the statistical probability that the Hood would have achieved at least one significant hit would have approached 75 to 80%. Consider the implications of this. The engagement that decided the fate of the Hood lasted approximately 10 minutes. If the engagement had lasted 11 minutes instead of 10 minutes, the outcome almost certainly would have been different. The Hood would have achieved at least one significant hit on the Bismarck. The Bismarck would have been damaged. The tactical situation would have been reversed. The British would have been pursuing a damaged enemy. The Germans would have been attempting to escape. The entire subsequent campaign to hunt down and sink the Bismarck would have been transformed. The Bismarck might have been sunk within hours instead of days. The British might have suffered no additional casualties in pursuit. The psychological impact would have been transformative. 1 minute. The engagement was decided by 1 minute. What most people don't understand about the Bismarck's subsequent sinking on May 27th is that it required multiple battleships and heavy cruisers to accomplish what the Hood and Prince of Wales had failed to do. It required a coordinated attack from the air, with Swordfish torpedo bombers from the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, damaging the Bismarck's rudder and slowing her down. It required a coordinated attack from the Rodney and King George V, the two newest and most powerful battleships in the Royal Navy. It required overwhelming force applied to a ship that was already damaged and low on fuel. The destruction of the Bismarck, when it finally occurred on May 27th, was not a close-run engagement. It was the execution. Multiple British warships concentrating their firepower on a single damaged enemy. But that execution was made necessary only because the Hood had failed to achieve victory on May 24th. Here's what the military historians discovered when they analyzed the alternative scenarios. If the Hood had survived, if the Hood had damaged the Bismarck on May 24th, the subsequent campaign would have been completely different. The Bismarck would have been hunted down by damaged British forces. The Bismarck might have limped toward the coast of France. The Bismarck might have been caught and sunk within 24 hours instead of 3 days. The British would have suffered no casualties in the subsequent pursuit. The Royal Navy's reputation would have been restored. The British would have proven that they could defeat German warships in direct combat. The psychological impact on the American observers would have been enormous. The Americans would have seen that British naval power was something to be relied upon, something to be supported, something that could defeat the Germans. What this means for understanding the broader picture of naval strategy in the Atlantic is worth reflecting on. The destruction of the Bismarck in May 1941 was supposed to be a demonstration of British naval power. Instead, the destruction of the Hood was a demonstration of German capability. The destruction of the Hood sent a message to the Americans that British naval power might not be as reliable as it seemed. The destruction of the Hood forced the British to recommit resources to defending the Atlantic. The destruction of the Hood delayed British operations in other theaters. The destruction of the Hood changed the entire character of the war. And all of that was contingent on one shell striking the Hood at one particular angle, at one particular moment, fired by one German gunnery officer who happened to complete his calculations at the exact moment when the opportunity presented itself. The question that haunted British naval planners for the rest of the war was simple. What if? What if the Hood had survived that engagement? What if the Hood had achieved victory? The answer is that the entire strategic situation would have been different. The Atlantic would have been secured more firmly. The British would have had more resources for other theaters. The Americans would have been more confident in British capability. The war might have progressed faster. The war might have ended months earlier. And that difference of months might have meant the difference between millions of lives saved or lost, all contingent on the physics of how one shell happened to strike one ship on one day in May 1941. What the Royal Navy's subsequent strategy revealed was that they had learned the lesson of the Hood. They had learned that battle cruisers with weak deck armor were not viable in modern naval warfare. They had learned that armor protection had to be comprehensive, not concentrated in certain areas and weak in others. The British began a program of modernizing their older ships, improving deck armor and protection against plunging fire. The British became more cautious about engaging German warships. The British preferred to work with overwhelming force rather than engaging in close-run engagements where chance could intervene. The destruction of the Hood forced the British to change their entire naval doctrine, and that change in doctrine meant that similar encounters were avoided for the rest of the war. But here's the contradiction that historians have struggled with. If the Hood had survived on May 24th, if the Hood had achieved victory, the British might not have learned the lesson about modern armor protection. The British might have believed that battlecruisers were still viable. The British might have continued building battlecruisers or converting existing ships to battlecruiser configuration. The British might have made different strategic decisions based on a false confidence in outdated ship designs. In a sense, the destruction of the Hood was a harsh but necessary lesson that forced the British to modernize. If the Hood had survived, that lesson might never have been learned until it was too late, until other British ships had been lost to the same vulnerabilities. What most people don't realize is that the Hood-Bismarck engagement was not the only time that such contingencies were at play. During the naval war in the Atlantic, multiple engagements in the early part of the war were decided by chance, by angles of impact, by moments when gunnery officers happened to complete their calculations at particular times. The sinking of the German commerce raider Graf Spee in December 1940 was contingent on the enemy not realizing how damaged the British ships actually were. The engagement with the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in February 1942 was contingent on British radar advantage. The engagement with the Tirpitz in April 1944 was contingent on the timing of the attack by British aircraft. Naval warfare is full of these contingencies, but the Hood-Bismarck engagement is perhaps the most famous because the stakes were so high and the outcome was so dramatic. The evidence suggests that naval combat in the early 1940s was less determined by design and doctrine and more determined by chance than military. Historians often acknowledge the best designed ship could be defeated by luck. The most advanced radar could be outmaneuvered by chance. The greatest tactical skill could be negated by contingency. The Hood was not a bad ship. The Hood was not an inferior ship. The Hood was defeated because of the particular geometry of the engagement and the particular moment when shells happened to be in flight. Under different circumstances, the Hood would have prevailed. Under circumstances slightly different by minutes or degrees, the Hood would have survived. But this particular engagement with this particular geometry and this particular timing was shaped in such a way that the Bismarck prevailed, and all the contingency of history turned on that single outcome. What if the Bismarck had been sunk on May 24th? Then the greatest and most powerful battleship that Nazi Germany built would have been destroyed before she ever fired a shot at merchant shipping. The Bismarck would have been just a brief episode in the naval war, a ship that was sunk in her first engagement. The German Navy would have been forced to rebuild. The German Navy would have lost the opportunity to demonstrate that they had built a superior warship. The British would have been free to operate in the Atlantic without the fear of German battleships. The entire strategic situation would have been different. But that's not what happened. The Bismarck survived. The Bismarck went on to sink the Hood. The Bismarck became a legend. The Bismarck became the symbol of German naval engineering and German naval power. And all of that was contingent on the physics of one shell, fired from one gun, traveling through the air at one particular moment, striking one particular ship at one particular angle. That is how history actually works. History is not predetermined. History is contingent. History is full of moments where the outcome could have been completely different if just one variable had been different. The Hood-Bismarck engagement on May 24, 1941, is perhaps the clearest example of that contingency that exists in the entire history of World War II.